This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. Brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I am your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a professor of international studies at the University of Washington in the United States, and he is the author of several books, including, most recently, Shifting Sands, the United States in the Middle East, that was recently published by Columbia University Press. Professor Joel Migdal, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So let's talk about American foreign policy in the Middle East. Can it really be described as a coherent policy, or was it just a haphazard series of diplomatic impulses that determined Washington's relationship to the region?
The United States' policy in the Middle East is very much a part of its larger global policy, and that's true since the end of World War II. At that time, the United States really was transforming into a global power where it was going to be everywhere in the world, in every region, unlike any other power. And it really had to figure out an overall strategy of how it was going to do that. The first strategy was developed by President Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and that yielded a lot of institutions that we're familiar with today: the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the UN, the Security Council. But that didn't last long because of the Cold War. And the United States had an overall policy containment people have heard about that really took them to all corners of the earth. And what they did in the Middle East was very much a part of that. And their strategy was as follows. 2 points. One, the U.S. would go bankrupt if it tried to do things alone. It therefore sought military partners. And the model was NATO. NATO was the first military alliance, and then it sought others. And in the Middle East, it went through so many possibilities of military alliances, but they all failed. Mm-hmm. And the second was that the United States sought a strategic partner in each region, something like Britain in the European context, or Japan or Korea in the Asian context, and it sought the same in the Middle East. And this was part of its success and part of its failure in the region.
How so? And also, is this where Israel comes in? Would you say that Israel is really the paradigmatic strategic partner in the Middle East?
For a long time, not. After 1948 and the recognition of Israel, the State Department really determined that Israel would not be a good strategic partner because of the conflict with the Arabs, and therefore, if the United States befriended Israel and relied on Israel as a strategic partner, then they would turn off the Arabs at a time when Arab nationalism, when Arab independence was just coming online.
But isn't that by the nature of finding a strategic alliance that you would antagonize their rivals in any region where they are?
Right. But the question is which rivals? And the United States was trying to woo Arab countries rather than allying with the Soviet Union to ally with the United States. And it was afraid that that would be undercut by an alliance with Israel. And that was true for the 1950s and the 1960s. In 1970, that changed. There was a key event in 1970, and then from 1970 to 1990, Israel was a strategic partner. Let me say what I mean by a strategic partner. A strategic partner is a partner that will do what you're not willing to do yourself, and in your benefit. And I can tell you why. I think in 1970 to 1990, and since then, Israel has not been a strategic partner of the United States.
Why 1970 and not 1967?
Not much happened after 1967, but in 1970, a key event happened. It was what we call Black September. Many of the listeners will remember this hijacking of 4 planes, flying some of them to Jordan, blowing them up on international TV, and the civil war that broke out between the PLO and the Jordanian government. And during that civil war, the Syrians entered the war on the side of the PLO. Now, the Syrians were Soviet allies. The PLO was a Soviet client. Jordan was an American client. And the Americans feared that, in fact, their client, Jordan, would be overthrown by Syria. Mm-hmm. And so the question was, what could the United States do about this? Well, it was deeply enmeshed in Cambodia and Vietnam at the time. Actually, interestingly, the Minister of Defense, Melvin Laird, at the time, went to Nixon, the president, and said, here's what's happened. And Nixon said, okay, bomb them. This was the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Bomb them. But Laird didn't want to bomb them because of all the entanglements that the United States had elsewhere. It didn't want to open another military front.
Right. But how was it different from 1967, where the East-West divide was equally clear? Israel is a Western, not American, but a Western allied country, as opposed to what will later be, or were clearly starting to become, the Arab countries orbiting towards the Soviet Union. I'm trying to understand why this specific event was the watershed and not larger strategic developments in the region.
Well, so remember, first of all, that 1967 had mixed enemies. It had Jordan, which was an American ally, plus Syria and Egypt, which were close to the Soviet Union. So it was, first of all, it was mixed. Second of all, it was very fast. There was some thinking about a flotilla and all sorts of things that people will remember that in which the United States would support Israel. But the commitment wasn't there on the part of the United States because they were so deeply enmeshed in Vietnam, and they weren't ready to act on their own. Mm-hmm. And so this 1970 was crucial because they came to Israel and said, actually to Yitzhak Rabin, who was the ambassador to the United States, and said, you do it. You go in for us and you defeat the Syrians. And Rabin checked with the Prime Minister, Golda Meir, and everything was set. Israel actually never intervened. It brought its troops up to the border. Its planes buzzed the Syrian convoys, and the Syrians turned around. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of controversy about why the Syrians turned around. We could talk about that if you like, but the key was that Nixon said, you are now our strategic ally. Mm-hmm. He said this to Abba Evan.
And you said that finding a strategic partner worked in America's benefit, but also led to many of its failures in the Middle East. How so?
Well, that period after 1970 was the period of the greatest success for the United States, because after the Yom Kippur War, the United States found that the old myth that it can't be friends with both Arabs and Israel fell by the wayside. It allied with Egypt and Israel after the disengagement agreements and finally the peace treaty. And so those were the periods in which the gains of the Soviet Union in the 50s and 60s were reversed. And it was the heyday of the United States' period in the Middle East, both the 70s and the 80s.
Mm-hmm. And then in 1990, again, things change. Is this because the Cold War ends? And as you said, this strategy was devised as some way of managing the world during the Cold War, and once the Cold War is no longer there, the strategy expires? Precisely.
And the first Gulf War showed that in grand relief. What happened? The United States established a broad coalition of over 30 countries to fight Saddam Hussein, who had invaded Kuwait. And many of those countries, including Syria, Turkey, Egypt, and Morocco, and others, said, if Israel joins, we're out. And so Israel again was seen as not a benefit, but a detriment to the United States. And Israel came to the United States during the war and said, we'll help you. We have the best troops. We have the best army. We have the best hospital facilities. We have the best ports. We can do everything for you. And what did the United States say? Get lost. Basically, Moshe Ahrens went to the Defense Department and found that he couldn't even meet with people. He was the defense minister at the time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the Gulf War in 1991 was again a watershed in its own right. Did America revise its strategy afterwards, or was it still going just like, an ocean liner, that it takes some time to change direction?
Well, the 1990s were like an ocean liner. It was a period in which the United States foreign policy was not clear. Now that it didn't have the Soviet Union as an enemy, what was it going to do? For Israel, it was clear that this was not good. Its initial reaction to the collapse of the Soviet Union was terrific. Our patron, the United States, won. The patron of Syria and the PLO lost, Iraq. And then the opposite happened, right? The opposite was that, in fact, not having the Soviet Union as an enemy and therefore the United States to oppose really meant that the United States didn't have to rely much on Israel. Mm-hmm. Now, what happened in this period was interesting. And it continued into the 2000s when the United States did develop a strategic view. And that was that there was a lot of hugging of Israel. Israel has a special relationship with us. We love Israel, but no strategic relationship. And this bothered Israeli leaders in the sense that they kept trying to find ways, fighting terror and other ways of finding a strong strategic relationship in which the United States would need them as much as they needed the United States.
Mm-hmm. Which was the case, as you said, in the 1970s and 80s. And in retrospect, did it prove to be up to scrutiny? Did America really rely on Israel and could not do without it?
During the 1970s and 80s? Yeah, I think that was true, that there were lots of differences between the United States and Israel at that time, no doubt about it. But during that period, they relied on Israeli deterrence to forestall any possible moves by Soviet clients or by the Soviet Union itself to expand its influence in the region. And in fact, what you saw was shrinking Soviet influence, and I think the United States felt through that entire period, Reagan said so, that Israel was helpful.
Yeah, but my question is, how instrumental really was Israel in all this?
Well, it's very hard to know, because deterrence means somebody doesn't do something.
Yeah.
And so it's very hard to know why they don't do something. But within the United States foreign policy establishment, there was a feeling that Israel was key here in that deterrence.
Mm-hmm. And this outlook of looking for a strategic partner that, as you said, for some time worked for America's benefit in the Middle East, did it prove itself also elsewhere in the world, in the Far East, in Europe?
Well, what the United States found was that it was very hard to replicate the UK in other parts of the world. So in Africa, in South Asia, even in East Asia, it was finding that these partners were not as reliable as it hoped they would be. The Brazils, the Argentinas were having coups, were unreliable, inconsistent, and the United States had a very difficult time finding the kind of strategic alliances it wanted. It did develop a military alliance in Southeast Asia, the SEATO, but elsewhere it really had difficulty playing the role that it wanted to play.
Mm-hmm. Fast forward to today. How would you say Obama's hands-off approach to the Middle East, how does it fit in to that tradition that you explore in your book? Is it does it stand in contrast to it, or is it in some way a continuation of it?
In some way it's a continuation, but you can't understand Obama without understanding his predecessor, George W. Bush, because the United States is coming off the longest wars in its history, in Afghanistan and in Iraq, wars that were not terribly popular, and off a great recession that in large part was due to the war in Iraq because of the nearly $5 trillion that were spent there. So what you see now is a kind of reversal from the strategic vision of George W. Bush. George W. Bush had the strongest strategic vision of any president
that wasn't
in
just
recent times.
Reactive as his predecessors was.
That's right. He had a very strong strategic vision. It happened to be misguided, to my mind. But Obama was coming off and was saying we have to go back to multilateralism, which was not part of Bush's strategy. We have to go back to reliance on the Europeans. They're going to be key for us. We have to involve ourselves in negotiations and diplomacy and not military might all the time. So while Obama tried to project U.S. power, he was doing it while withdrawing from the kind of military might that had been used before. And this was, in the Middle East, seen as an overall withdrawal of U.S. interest in the region.
Mm-hmm. And again, another key player here that we need to understand in order to see the broader picture is America's policy vis-à-vis Iran. From the eve of the Islamic Revolution of 1979 to the nuclear deal last year, how does America's Iran policy fit into the overall scheme that you just described?
Well, for Obama, the policy towards Iran is very much like the United States' policy in the 1970s and 80s towards the Soviet Union. What do I mean by that? The Soviet Union was seen as an enemy, and it was seen as having an incompatible ideology, one that was aggressive and that the United States had to counter. And at the same time, the United States saw itself engaging with the Soviet Union. Negotiations, disarmament, SALT I, SALT II, all sorts of deals that could be made, commercial relations. So this is what Obama saw for Iran. Iran has an aggressive, radical ideology that opposes United States interests in the Middle East, but it has to be engaged. You have to negotiate with it. You have to get deals with it. You have to offer it some carrots so that it will not be as aggressive as it might have otherwise been. This has been Obama's vision.
Mm-hmm. But again, it's pretty different from a superpower like the Soviet Union, right? I mean, the question of engaging another power, I mean, applying the logic of the Cold War when taking into account this really great disparity of power is questionable, isn't it?
Well, it is. And the question for the United States is, can you treat a regional power, which was what Iran is basically, can you treat a regional power the way you treated a global power? And Obama's answer was yes, you can.
What is your take on it?
Well, I actually think that Obama was into something, but he wasn't projecting enough military force behind what he was doing. And here Israel comes in. Mm-hmm. To my mind, what the United States was saying to Israel from the beginning of the Obama administration is, look, you are going to project the military power because you're the only nuclear power in the region. You are going to be the deterrence. You're going to be our strategic partner again, the deterrence against Iranian aggressiveness. But you have to solve this little Palestinian problem if you're going to do that, because we can't get you to be part of an alliance with the Saudis, with the Egyptians, with the Jordanians, with the Persian Gulf, unless you get rid of this problem. Once you do that, you are going to be part of a broad front against Iran. And Israel didn't buy it.
Mm-hmm. But it still worked out in a way, didn't it?
Well, partially. I think that Israel tends to exaggerate to some degree its strategic relations with the Sunni Arab states. I think it could have been much stronger. And its relations with the United States are really touchy now, and I don't think this is in Israel's interest.
Mm-hmm. Looking back on the 70-odd years that you explore in your book, can you think of a single policy decision that could have been made otherwise and made things very different, either for the better or the worse?
Well, that's a very good question. I think there were times when the United States could have had a little more backbone with Israel and moved more forcefully towards a two-state solution. And particularly, I'm thinking in the post-Oslo years, there really was a possibility for a two-state solution.
Under Bush?
Under Clinton.
Oh, I see. Post the Oslo Accord. Right. Mm-hmm.
Under Clinton. And I think, again, under Bush. And Bush's notion of the Middle East, which is not crazy, was this is a region that nobody has been able to tame. And many presidents have sunk a lot into it and gotten very little out of it, including his father, the first President Bush. Mm-hmm. And so his notion was, okay, we're not going to do much here. Obama, after his initial failure with the Palestinians and Israelis, his notion was a pivot towards Asia. And it was the same motivation. This is a region that causes the United States tremendous trouble and can't be tamed. Let's go somewhere where people are producing things, economies are growing, there are no wars. East Asia is the place. But it couldn't. It couldn't extricate itself from what's going on in this region.
Mm-hmm. Which is likely to be at the top of the agenda of the next administration, you think?
Right. And you hear echoes of this, by the way, in the current presidential debate. Donald Trump is talking about, while he often talks very aggressively, is really talking about what do we need to get involved there? Mm-hmm. And some of the others as well. Ted Cruz also, while talking about carpet bombing of ISIS, at the same time is really talking about a kind of, we don't need this. This is not good for America.
Mm-hmm. Right, and on this note, we'll have to wrap up. Professor Joel Migdal, you're a professor of international studies at the University of Washington and the author of the recently published Shifting Sands, the United States in the Middle East. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you.
And also big thanks to Alex Benish, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick.
איך אני קניתי